Sometimes the most dangerous person in a courtroom is the one everyone believes does not belong there. The courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, was already alive before 9 in the morning. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, while lawyers shuffled stacks of documents and security officers monitored the entrance with practiced indifference. Everything moved with the same predictable rhythm, until one woman quietly walked through the doors. Naomi Carter wore a dark navy blazer, simple black slacks, and thin silver glasses that framed an expression impossible to read. She carried no sense of urgency, no visible frustration, and no need to draw attention to herself. Yet somehow attention found her anyway. A few people glanced twice as she entered the courtroom. Others exchanged subtle looks before returning to their conversations. Naomi simply chose a seat near the center row and opened a folder resting neatly on her lap. She appeared calm, almost invisible, but there was something unusual about her composure. It was the kind of stillness people carried when they had nothing to prove. 30 feet away stood Officer Daniel Brooks, a veteran courthouse officer whose reputation for strict enforcement was well known throughout the building. Tall, broad-shouldered, and permanently convinced he was the smartest person in every room, he noticed Naomi immediately. His eyes narrowed. He watched her for several seconds before walking toward her with measured steps. The room grew quieter without anyone understanding why. Daniel stopped beside her seat and crossed his arms. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "This area is reserved for authorized personnel." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes from her folder. "I understand," she answered calmly. "Then you should leave," he replied. Naomi maintained eye contact for a moment. "I have business here today." Daniel let out a short laugh. "People always say that." He pointed toward the courtroom doors. "Out. Now." Several spectators turned to watch. Some pretended not to listen, but nobody looked away completely. Naomi closed her folder and stood up without resistance. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply held the folder against her, sighed and looked at him with unsettling calmness. That expression irritated him even more. "You heard me," he said louder this time. "You cannot just walk in here and act like you belong." The room fell silent. A clerk behind a desk froze for half a second. An attorney stopped writing notes. Somewhere in the back row, someone lowered their coffee cup. Naomi said nothing. She simply observed him as if she were memorizing every detail. Daniel mistook her silence for submission. He gestured toward the exit with growing confidence. "Leave the courtroom immediately." Naomi nodded once and began walking toward the doors. But before she reached them, she paused for the briefest moment. Her eyes drifted across the room, carefully taking in every face, every reaction, every person who chose to remain silent. Then she continued walking. Nobody realized it yet, but the woman leaving that courtroom was not being removed from her mission. She was watching it unfold exactly as planned. And within the next hour, everyone inside that room would discover that the person they dismissed first was the only one who had been in control the entire time. There was something unsettling about a person who refused to react the way everyone expected. Naomi Carter stepped into the courthouse hallway without rushing, her heels making soft sounds against the polished floor as she walked toward a row of large windows overlooking downtown Richmond. Outside, the sky was gray and heavy with winter clouds, but inside, another kind of storm was quietly forming. Behind her, people had already begun whispering. A few courthouse employees exchanged glances while pretending to organize paperwork. An older attorney leaned toward a colleague and quietly asked, "Who was that woman?" Nobody had an answer. Naomi sat down on a wooden bench near the elevators and placed her folder beside her. Then she reached into her purse and took out a small notebook. Her expression never changed. She wrote something down, paused, and then looked up at the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. It was almost as if she was cataloging every detail around her. Meanwhile, back inside the courtroom, Officer Daniel Brooks felt a sense of satisfaction. He adjusted his uniform and returned to his position near the entrance. To him, the situation was already over. He had restored order, asserted his authority, and removed someone he believed did not belong there. But something bothered him. He could not explain why. It was her silence. Most people became nervous when confronted. Some argued. Some apologized. Some became emotional. Naomi had done none of those things. She had simply observed him. The memory lingered in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. A clerk named Melissa approached carefully while carrying a stack of files. "Officer Brooks," she said quietly, "are you sure that woman was not supposed to be here?" Daniel barely looked at her. "I know exactly what I am doing." Melissa hesitated. She just seemed very calm. Daniel scoffed. "Calm does not mean innocent. People learn how to act." Melissa nodded awkwardly and walked away, but uncertainty remained on her face. Down the hallway, Naomi stood up again. She adjusted her glasses and glanced at the courtroom doors from a distance. Then her phone vibrated once. She looked at the screen. There was no message displayed, only a simple notification showing the current time. 9:23 in the morning. Naomi slid the phone back into her purse and continued walking toward a coffee station near the lobby. She poured herself a cup, thanked the employee working there, and sat at another bench. She was not waiting. She was studying. Every movement around her seemed important. Every conversation mattered. Every expression was being quietly stored away. At that exact moment, Daniel glanced toward the hallway and spotted her again. Instead of leaving the building entirely, she was still there. That irritated him immediately. His jaw tightened. Why would she remain? Why did she look so comfortable? Why did she act as if she belonged? He started walking toward her again, unaware that every minute he spent approaching her was bringing him closer to a truth that would completely change the course of his day. Because Naomi Carter was not trying to prove she belonged inside that courthouse. She was measuring how quickly an entire system revealed its true face when it believed nobody important was watching. People reveal who they truly are when they believe there will be no consequences. Officer Daniel Brooks walked through the courthouse lobby with growing irritation. Naomi Carter was still there, seated quietly with a paper cup of coffee resting beside her folder. She was not pacing. She was not making phone calls. She was not arguing with anyone. In fact, she looked more relaxed than most of the employees rushing around her. Daniel approached with deliberate steps, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. Several people noticed immediately and lowered their voices. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes before he even spoke, as if she had anticipated his arrival. "You are still here," Daniel said. Naomi offered a polite smile. "It is a public building." Daniel folded his arms. "Not every area is open to everyone." She nodded once. "That is true." The answer caught him off guard. He expected resistance. Instead, he got calm agreement. His frustration grew. He pointed toward the main entrance. "Then maybe you should head home." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Home can wait." Daniel exhaled sharply. "What exactly are you doing here?" Naomi looked around the lobby for a moment before answering. "Observing." Daniel laughed quietly. "Observing what?" She paused. "People." For a second, his expression hardened. Something about her words unsettled him. Most people became uncomfortable under his authority. Naomi seemed untouched by it. Nearby, a young courthouse intern named Ethan glanced toward them while carrying files to an office. He slowed his pace for a moment before continuing on. Across the lobby, a receptionist looked up from her computer, and then immediately looked back down again. Everyone sensed tension building, but nobody wanted to get involved. Daniel leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Let me give you some advice. This place runs on rules." Naomi nodded again. "Rules are important." Daniel almost rolled his eyes. "Then follow them." Naomi stared at him for a brief moment. There was no fear in her expression. No resentment either. Only patience. Then she said something unexpected. "Rules only work when they apply equally to everyone." The sentence landed in the air like a stone dropping into still water. Daniel immediately straightened his posture. "What is that supposed to mean?" Naomi took a sip of coffee before answering. "It means consistency matters." Daniel scoffed. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." Naomi remained calm. Sometimes simple situations reveal complicated truths. He shook his head and walked away without another word. But the irritation stayed with him. As he returned toward the courtroom, he noticed something unusual. A tall man in a charcoal suit had entered the building and was standing near a directory map. The man briefly glanced at Naomi before continuing down another hallway. Daniel barely paid attention to it. What he did not know was that Naomi noticed everything. The man, the cameras, the conversations, even the exact moment Daniel chose to walk away. She reached for her notebook again and wrote a few words before closing it carefully. Then she checked the time once more. 9:37 in the morning. Exactly on schedule. Across the courthouse, invisible pieces were beginning to move into place. Yet nobody could see the larger picture. They still believed Naomi Carter was simply a woman who had been turned away from a courtroom. They had no idea that every interaction, every assumption, and every decision being made around her was quietly becoming evidence in a much larger investigation. The smallest details are often the ones people ignore until it is too late. By 9:45 in the morning, the courthouse had become noticeably busier. Footsteps echoed through every corridor while printers hummed and courthouse employees moved from office to office carrying folders and coffee cups. Everything looked ordinary on the surface, but Naomi Carter could already see patterns emerging. She remained seated near the lobby, her notebook resting beside her untouched coffee. Across from her, a maintenance worker adjusted a light fixture while quietly observing the flow of people. Two attorneys argued over schedules near an elevator. A deputy clerk hurried toward the records office. Naomi noticed all of it. Then she noticed something else. Officer Daniel Brooks had begun watching her from a distance instead of returning to his normal routine. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward her. Curiosity was slowly replacing confidence. That was exactly what Naomi expected. Daniel walked toward another officer standing near the security checkpoint. The younger officer, Michael Turner, appeared uneasy as Daniel spoke to him. Michael glanced toward Naomi before lowering his voice. Daniel shook his head dismissively. Michael hesitated again before returning to his duties. Naomi did not need to hear their conversation. Their body language said enough. Then something even more interesting happened. A woman in a charcoal gray suit walked into the courthouse carrying a leather briefcase. She approached the information desk and quietly exchanged a few words with the receptionist before taking a seat near the opposite end of the lobby. She never looked directly at Naomi, but Naomi noticed her immediately. 10 seconds later, Naomi reached into her purse and adjusted her phone without unlocking it. Another silent notification appeared. 9:48 in the morning. Right on time. Daniel noticed none of it. Instead, he marched back toward Naomi with renewed determination. He stopped in front of her and crossed his arms once again. "You are still observing people," he said with a sarcastic smile. Naomi looked up calmly. "Yes." Daniel shook his head. "You have a lot of time on your hands." Naomi answered softly. "Sometimes important things require patience." Daniel let out a laugh. "There is nothing important happening here." Naomi held his gaze for a moment. "Are you sure about that?" The question lingered in the air. Daniel immediately felt defensive, though he could not explain why. Around them, several employees quietly listened while pretending to work. Naomi stood up slowly and picked up her folder. For a split second, part of a document inside became visible. Daniel caught a glimpse of official seals and multiple highlighted pages before she closed it again. He narrowed his eyes. "What is in there?" Naomi smiled politely. "Information." Daniel scoffed. "About what?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Accountability." Then she walked away toward another hallway, leaving him standing in place. Daniel watched her disappear around a corner, completely unaware that every minute he spent questioning her was creating a timeline that somebody else was already documenting. Hidden cameras were recording. Entry logs were updating. Witnesses were taking mental notes. The courthouse still believed this was an ordinary Tuesday morning. But the truth was far more dangerous. Naomi Carter was not waiting for permission to belong there. She was waiting for an entire system to expose itself one decision at a time. The moment people believe nobody important is watching, they stop hiding who they really are. 10 o'clock arrived, and the courthouse had settled into its usual rhythm. But Naomi Carter knew something had changed. She could feel it in the atmosphere. Conversations became shorter whenever she walked by. Employees glanced toward her before quickly looking away. Even Officer Daniel Brooks had become more distracted than before. He was no longer simply enforcing rules. Now he was trying to understand her, and that uncertainty was beginning to make him uncomfortable. Naomi walked toward a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs of former judges and courthouse officials. She paused at each frame for a few seconds, studying the faces and the dates beneath them. Then she reached a large window overlooking the city and stopped. Richmond stretched out beneath gray skies while traffic moved steadily through downtown streets. She stood there silently until she heard footsteps behind her. It was Judge Eleanor Whitmore. The respected federal judge carried a stack of documents and slowed her pace when she saw Naomi. Their eyes met briefly. Naomi offered a polite nod. The judge returned it and continued walking without saying a word. But Naomi noticed something else. The judge glanced back once before disappearing around a corner. Another detail. Another observation. Meanwhile, Daniel stood inside the courtroom reviewing schedules for the next hearing. Yet he was not focused on the paperwork in front of him. His thoughts kept returning to Naomi, the folder, the notebook, the strange confidence she carried. None of it made sense. He finally approached Melissa again. "Did you figure out who she is?" Melissa looked up from her computer. "No, but she has not broken any rules since leaving the courtroom." Daniel frowned. "That is not the point." Melissa hesitated. "Then what is the point?" Daniel did not answer because he did not know himself. Across the building, Naomi sat at a small wooden table and opened her folder for only a few seconds. Inside were several pages covered with dates, names, and observations. A courthouse map sat beneath them with small handwritten notes in the margins. Then she closed it again. A man in a charcoal suit walked by once more, never speaking to her, but slowing down long enough to place a newspaper on the table beside her. He kept walking without breaking stride. Naomi calmly picked up the newspaper. Between 2 pages was a tiny note. 3 words. "Proceed as planned." She folded the newspaper and placed it inside her bag. Nearby, a security camera quietly rotated toward the lobby entrance. Employees moved through metal detectors. Attorneys prepared for afternoon hearings. Nobody realized they were all participating in something much bigger than a normal courthouse day. Daniel emerged from another hallway and saw Naomi once again. This time his patience was gone. He approached her and said, "I have never seen anyone spend this much time in a building they supposedly have no business being in." Naomi slowly stood up and adjusted her glasses. Then she answered in the same calm voice she had used all morning. "Maybe this building has more business with me than you realize." Daniel froze for half a second before forcing a laugh. He dismissed her words and walked away. But uncertainty had already settled into his mind. What he still did not understand was that Naomi Carter was no longer evaluating one officer. She was evaluating an entire environment. Every choice people made was adding another piece to a puzzle that was almost complete. And somewhere inside that courthouse, a countdown was quietly approaching its final stage. Truth rarely arrives with flashing lights. More often it walks quietly into a room that has already made up its mind. 10:15 in the morning brought a subtle shift throughout the courthouse. Employees who had been moving confidently earlier now seemed more cautious. Conversations stopped whenever certain people entered a room. Doors that normally stayed open were suddenly closed. Naomi Carter noticed every change. She stood near a large bulletin board reviewing hearing schedules while appearing completely ordinary. Yet beneath that calm exterior, she knew the final phase had already begun. She checked the time once again. 10:16. Perfect. Across the building, Officer Daniel Brooks was becoming increasingly restless. He sat behind a desk pretending to review paperwork, but his attention remained fixed on Naomi. Something about her presence disrupted his sense of control. He could not explain it. She had not raised her voice once. She had not broken a single rule. Yet somehow she had managed to occupy every corner of his attention. That realization irritated him even more. Daniel stood up and walked into the hallway where Judge Eleanor Whitmore was speaking with another attorney. "Excuse me, Judge," he said. "Have you heard anything about the woman who has been wandering around all morning?" Judge Whitmore looked at him carefully. "The woman in the navy blazer?" Daniel nodded. "She has been observing everything." The judge paused before answering. "Sometimes observing is exactly what people are supposed to be doing." Daniel frowned. "That is a strange answer." Judge Whitmore gathered her files and walked away without another word. Daniel remained frozen for a moment. Across the lobby, Naomi noticed the interaction from a distance. Then her phone vibrated once. This time a message appeared. Stage 6 complete. She slipped the phone back into her purse and walked toward a quiet conference room near the records office. The door was partially open. Inside, the same woman in the charcoal gray suit sat reviewing documents while the man from earlier stood near a projector screen. Neither acknowledged Naomi directly, but all three exchanged brief glances that said more than words ever could. Naomi nodded once and continued walking without stopping. The operation was moving exactly as planned. Back in the main corridor, Daniel suddenly noticed her emerging from that area. His eyes narrowed immediately. Why was she entering restricted sections? Why did nobody stop her? He quickly approached her. "You seem very comfortable walking around this building," he said. Naomi smiled politely. Familiar places tend to feel comfortable. Daniel folded his arms. "Familiar? Have you been here before?" Naomi looked directly into his eyes. "Many times." The answer sent a strange chill through him. For the first time all morning, uncertainty began replacing authority. He searched her face for clues, but she offered none. Then she said something that stayed with him long after she walked away. Sometimes people spend years inside a building without truly understanding what it is meant to protect. Daniel watched her disappear down another hallway. Around him, employees continued working, elevators opened and closed, and court proceedings carried on as usual. Yet he could feel something approaching. Something bigger than an ordinary misunderstanding. What he still did not realize was that this day had never been about a woman entering a courtroom. It had always been a test. And in just a few more moments, every decision he had made since 9 o'clock that morning would begin speaking louder than any explanation he could possibly give. Power changes the moment truth finally introduces itself. At 10:30 in the morning, Judge Eleanor Whitmore stepped out of her chambers and addressed everyone in the hallway. Her voice was calm but firm. "Officer Brooks, please escort everyone back into Courtroom 3. We have an important announcement before the next hearing begins." Employees immediately gathered their files and returned to their seats. Attorneys stopped their conversations. Clerks hurried inside. Daniel nodded confidently and began directing people back into the room. Then he saw Naomi Carter walking toward the courtroom as well. His expression hardened instantly. "Excuse me," he said. "I already told you that you do not belong in there." Naomi stopped and looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried all morning. Before she could answer, Judge Whitmore spoke from behind him. "She absolutely belongs there." Daniel turned around in confusion. "Your Honor?" Judge Whitmore walked toward Naomi and offered a respectful nod. "Thank you for your patience this morning, Miss Carter." Several people inside the courtroom immediately looked up from their seats. The atmosphere changed in an instant. Daniel blinked twice, unsure if he had heard correctly. Naomi entered the courtroom and placed her folder on the front table. The room became so quiet that even the hum of the lights seemed louder. Then the man in the charcoal suit entered from another door, followed by the woman carrying the gray briefcase. Daniel suddenly recognized them. Federal personnel. His stomach tightened. Naomi slowly opened her folder and removed an identification wallet. She placed it on the table and unfolded it. The gold letters reflected under the fluorescent lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Operations Division. Several people gasped quietly. Daniel froze where he stood. His confidence disappeared immediately. Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady and professional. "My name is Naomi Carter. I am a senior supervisory special agent assigned to an ongoing federal review concerning courthouse procedures, employee conduct, and patterns of unequal treatment involving public access and authority misuse." The room remained completely silent. Naomi continued. "Over the past 8 months, my team has monitored reports involving unnecessary confrontations, selective enforcement, and behavior that discourages equal access to public institutions. Today was the final phase of that evaluation." Daniel stared at her, unable to say anything. Every interaction from that morning replayed inside his mind. Every assumption, every decision, every word. Naomi looked directly at him, but there was no anger in her eyes, only professionalism. Then she said something nobody in the room would ever forget. "You did not know who I was today, Officer Brooks. But that was never the point. The real question is this. How many other people have been treated the same way simply because you believe they were unimportant? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Daniel had no answer. The truth was standing right in front of him now. Naomi closed her folder and picked up her identification. Sometimes people think authority gives them permission to decide who belongs, she said softly. But public institutions do not belong to one person. They belong to everyone. Around the courtroom, faces changed from curiosity to realization. And for the very first time that day, Officer Daniel Brooks understood something he had never considered before. The calmest person in the building had also been the most powerful one all along. Consequences do not always arrive with punishment first. Sometimes they arrive with reflection. The silence inside Courtroom 3 lasted several seconds after Naomi Carter finished speaking. Nobody seemed eager to move because everyone was processing the same realization at once. This had never been an ordinary morning. Every conversation, every assumption, and every action had become part of something much larger. Naomi carefully gathered her documents while the federal personnel standing nearby began organizing their files. Judge Eleanor Whitmore addressed the room with a calm voice. Effective immediately, all findings from this review will be forwarded for internal assessment and procedural improvements. This institution exists to serve the public equally and without prejudice. Around the room, employees lowered their eyes. Some appeared embarrassed. Others seemed relieved that the truth was finally visible. Officer Daniel Brooks remained standing near the doorway. For the first time in many years, he had nothing to say. The confidence he carried every day was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Self-awareness. Naomi walked toward him, stopping several feet away. She did not raise her voice. She did not humiliate him. She simply spoke with honesty. This was never about catching one person making a mistake, she said. It was about understanding how easily small decisions can affect the lives of people who walk through these doors every single day. Daniel swallowed hard and looked around the courtroom. He remembered Melissa asking if he was sure. He remembered dismissing her concern. He remembered every interaction with Naomi that morning. The answers had always been there, but he had never stopped long enough to see them. I thought I was protecting the system, he finally said quietly. Naomi nodded once. Many people believe that. Then she answered with a sentence that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. But protecting a system and protecting people are not always the same thing. Daniel lowered his eyes. Across the courtroom, the young intern Ethan sat perfectly still. The receptionist who had watched everything from her desk stood with folded hands. Even the attorneys who had remained silent all morning now looked thoughtful. Everyone had learned something that day. Naomi picked up her folder and prepared to leave. As she walked toward the exit, Daniel spoke again. Miss Carter. She stopped and turned around. He hesitated before saying, I should have treated you differently. Naomi offered a small smile. No, you should have treated me the same way you would treat anyone else. The room became silent once more. That was the lesson nobody would forget. Equal respect was never supposed to depend on titles, uniforms, or identification badges. It was supposed to be the starting point. Naomi then walked out into the courthouse hallway one final time. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead. The city still moved outside the windows. Everything looked exactly the same, yet everything felt different. Because sometimes the biggest changes happen without noise. They happen the moment people realize that character is revealed long before identity is. The most important lesson from that day was never about an identification badge. It was about what people choose to do before they ever see one. Nearly an hour later, the courthouse slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Phones rang. Printers hummed. Attorneys gathered their files and headed toward their next hearings. But something had undeniably changed. The atmosphere felt lighter, quieter, almost reflective. People were no longer rushing through the building without noticing one another. They were paying attention. Naomi Carter stood near the main entrance one last time before leaving. Sunlight had finally begun breaking through the gray clouds outside, sending soft reflections across the marble floor. She adjusted her glasses, picked up her folder, and took one final look around the building. This place looked exactly the same as it had at 9 o'clock that morning, yet somehow it was completely different. Across the lobby, Melissa offered her a grateful smile. Ethan nodded respectfully as he walked by carrying another stack of files. Even Judge Eleanor Whitmore paused briefly before returning to her chambers. Every person inside that building would remember this day for a different reason. But one person would remember it more than anyone else. Officer Daniel Brooks remained near the courtroom entrance, watching Naomi prepare to leave. He looked older somehow, not because time had passed but because perspective had arrived. There was no anger left in his face. No defensiveness. Only thoughtfulness. He finally understood something that years of experience had never taught him. Authority was not a shield against accountability. It was a responsibility. Naomi walked toward the exit and stopped beside him one final time. Daniel looked at her and quietly said, "Thank you." Naomi seemed surprised for a moment. Then she smiled.